My readers are amazing people. Mark Groleau is a theologian, community activist, and honest seeker. To him, living more as Jesus did is more important than fixed doctrines. Shortly after God an Autobiography came out, Mark interviewed me for his Wikigod podcast. Here the tables are turned. In this searching discussion, I ask Mark where his life and spiritual journey are taking him today. You know, they kept saying I should interview some famous people, Deepak Chopra or somebody. I'm not interested in Deepak Chopra.
Okay. Yeah.
And they were suggesting this one and that one. No, I'm not interested in them.
Okay.
I want to interview someone if you don't have questions you want to ask them. And they said, who would you like to interview? And I said, my readers. You know, and what I have found dealing with you and others is everybody is coming from a different place. They have their own story. Yeah. The book relates to them in accord with their own spiritual journey, not some idea that everybody's got to be a certain place,
right? But
rather everybody takes it up in their own way.
Yeah. And, well, if that's the only qualification, then I suppose I am qualified.
Yeah, that is the qualification.
Because I feel wholly unworthy, but if you put it like that, I did read your book, so check.
Yes. In fact, Mark, I wanted to interview you in part because you were one of the first readers of the book outside, you know, my intimate friends.
Okay.
And, when I started doing media, and you had the Wikigod podcast, and somehow something came across your desk or in your about God and autobiography. Do you have any sense now, in thinking back, what struck you such that you thought, oh, this is somebody I'd like to interview? Because the Wikipod, you did interviews.
Yeah. When the podcast kind of got syndicated with the radio station and Faith Strong Today, the president there, Matt Cain, I mean, he gets a deluge of people kind of wanting their stuff out in the world and figuring that a large media outlet like that will give them exposure. It was kind of philosophical, intellectual, and so he punted it my way. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I broke my rule, which was always interview in person, right, and in Toronto. So that was like groundbreaking for me. When I called you from their studio, I had never done anything like that before. So that was a hugely intimidating factor. I didn't know what kind of person you would be. But I was really super nervous, not just to talk to you, not face-to-face, but in the studio. Usually I just hauled around my equipment, set it up across the table at a restaurant, and talked to somebody in Toronto. But I honestly, when I started exploring your book, I thought, I didn't even know if this was for real. Like, I thought I was getting punked in a way. Because God... like,
psycho fraud?
In a way. Like, to be honest, because the title... God an Autobiography. I looked it up online, like you said, and I just thought there was not much out there yet. I've landed on your website where you had been interviewed on other things, but I didn't know, honestly, is Jerry Martin a wingnut? What this is? And then when I started reading the book, I love that this is where you pulled me in right away, because in the first few pages, I think, you're like, you probably think I'm a wingnut.
Yeah, I did. I was a lifelong non-believer.
Right.
And the philosopher, where we're trained to question everything.
Yeah.
And here God was speaking to me. So the first challenge was, am I going to believe this? Am I going to believe it?
Yeah, so that was important to me, that if you have self-awareness that you might be a wingnut, you're probably not a wingnut.
That's true.
So I think that pulled me in and allowed me to read further. But that, your original question, I think, was, why did I give it consideration? And I mean, my podcast was about God. The kind of impetus for the podcast was people who are willing to explore God in a very open and honest, and in a way that even if it questions their own sense of belief or self or all of those bedrocks that we like to stand on, I want to talk to you about that if that's happening to you. And so, you know, you were that in spades. whether or not you were crazy. I got that sense of like God kind of rocked you off your feet, and so that's why I wanted to explore that with you.
Yeah, and what was your spiritual situation or journey up to that point?
How far back do you want to start?
Well, you start at the beginning. That's always a great place.
Okay. I'm going to try to. I don't want this to turn into a counseling session.
Right.
So I grew up in a very fundamentalist Pentecostal church, a sect of a sect. The kind of church that's every Sunday you heard that we are the only ones with the truth. Everybody else is going to hell in a handbasket. Not just other faiths, other like the Methodist Church, the block over, and especially the Catholics and the Wesley, whatever. They're all going down except our little group.
The wrong kind of Pentecostals.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because we were oneness Pentecostal, so anybody who believed in the Trinity was out. I mean, so many people were out, except us, fortunately. And that just became increasingly unpalatable throughout my teens. But I was getting groomed to be a preacher, and I was already preaching, and I was just coming to a point where, I wasn't sure about this. I went to university, and kind of very long story short, my degree was in English literature. So I was learning tools of how to read literature.
Yes.
And so form criticism, textual criticism, historical criticism, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I started applying what I'm, applying to Shakespeare and Chaucer by day, and coming home and reading the Bible, because we went to church like 3-4 times a week, and starting to apply those new skills to Scripture, and starting to think that maybe we're not bringing enough to bear to the text, just kind of that surface literalist reading. Started to ask the leadership questions about why do we believe this thing but not this thing? Why Paul but not Leviticus, when in essence we're saying, or why one verse of Leviticus and not another even. It was that close, because we would use like clothing rules from Leviticus but not food rules, and why. So that kind of thing. I was told to stop asking questions, and
danger sign.
How can you stop asking questions? So I left, and I kind of spun out into atheism, because when you're raised in a church that says every other church is wrong, and why. We were raised like to perform theological jujitsu on every other church. Like you'd go door knocking and hope a Trinitarian opened the door and try to just, turn them into knots. So I wasn't about to adopt a system of theological thought that I'd been trained how to deconstruct.
Yeah.
So I just had nowhere to go.
Yes.
And turned into essentially an atheist for a few years.
Yeah.
So that kind of super black and white God, who or destined everything and controlled your destiny, and right and wrong, and you would look at the world through a lens of that's right, that's wrong, that's right, that's wrong, and I'm the arbiter of that. I kind of speak for God. Once I didn't have to live that way anymore, it was so wonderful. I lived in Korea at the time. I remember I met a pastor, and my first objection to Christianity was just like, it's miserable going through life seeing evaluating everything through this, like, that's good, that's bad, that's good, that's bad. I said I loved that just kind of fell away, and I could just enjoy culture. I could go to a Buddhist temple and enjoy the intricately painted ceilings without thinking it was demonic or having to feel bad about it. I could enjoy human beings and culture, and I loved that. So I think that's how I was wired. It's just that when I was raised in a certain system, that was not allowed to flourish. And the second it was pulled away, I could kind of be who I am. Yeah.
And then when you, at the time you encountered God in Autobiography, where were you spiritually in your life? Was it a kind of up point or a down point, or more of a sideways point, or?
Yeah, I would love to hear the different experiences of your readers, because for me, I'm forever exploring. I graduated from seminary became a pastor. Thankfully, I'm in kind of the Anabaptist tradition where it's a big tent. You don't have to, you're not slapped or censured if you believe a certain thing. So I feel like I have a lot of theological room to explore. So, I mean, seminary, graduation day was by no means the end. I feel like it was just the beginning.
Yeah.
I got a certain kind of flavor of theology in seminary. It was a trans-denominational seminary. So, it was great that one prof was Presbyterian and one prof was Anglican and one prof was Pentecostal, which rehabilitated Pentecostalism for me somewhat. But I had been exploring process theology.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want to give a quick primer on process for anybody who might be watching this and not sure, but essentially I think at the core, process theology questions the ineffable God, kind of the omni-God of Greek theology that Christianity has kind of co-opted. Omnipresent, God is absolutely everywhere. God is omniscient. God knows everything. God is omnipotent. God, can do anything. Nothing is impossible for God. My daughter sings that after she comes home from Sunday school sometimes, and I cringe a little bit or add a little caveat. God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing that he cannot do. I'm like, well, maybe.
They got in these puzzles. Can God create, a rock heavier than he can lift?
Yeah. So that was an issue for maybe Aquinas. But
we have free will. If God already knows what you're going to have for lunch, do you really get to pick your lunch?
Yeah. So I think around the same time I had been kind of playing with this idea. In seminary, I went off campus and did a course with Jack Caputo.
Yeah.
Jacques Derrida kind of studies about the weakness of God. Caputo's all about the weakness of God. And in seminary, I was the raging liberal in the room, but then I went off campus to ICS downtown and I was the raging conservative in the room, which for me was just like literally just the room was upside down. And I couldn't go back to seminary and discuss this class because it's like the weakness of God. Maybe God can't do anything. So I started to explore, there's different categories. Is God self-limited?
Yes.
Is God inherently limited? Or is God unlimited in what God can do? So that's kind of, I was really into process and rethinking the omni-God when I picked up your book.
Let me say this about the process. In that view, God is evolving.
That's right.
Can't do everything, isn't perfect yet.
That's right.
But God is evolving and we're evolving, and we're all evolving as part of that story to something.
And ironically, in seminary, I spent my first 3 years immersed in Hebrew. So I was learning Hebrew, Hebrew exegesis. I was taking extra courses in Genesis and things like that. And the Hebrew professors have no trouble with this, with an anthropomorphic God, this God who is a basket case sometimes, changes God's mind. That's all in this rich tradition of the Hebrew scriptures.
Yes.
It's when we got into the New Testament classes and Greek, like learning Greek, ironically or fittingly, because of the Greek influence of kind of God and Plato on Christianity. That's where all that kind of disappeared, and it kind of my second, third, fourth year of seminary, it seemed really at odds with Hebrew profs and the Hebrew text that would be like, God sometimes doesn't seem to know what God's doing or changes God's mind or wants to test things or see things.
Yes.
So I knew that it wasn't like total heresy. It always depends on who you talk to, right? Everybody is somebody's heretic, as the saying goes. So, so it depends on who you're talking to. But your book came along at a time where I was genuinely shocked at how commensurate it was with what I was feeling and thinking. That's what I'm saying. I'd be interested to see somebody who picks up your book and is just so like, what do I do? What do I do with this? It's so crazy. Because I know plenty of people who would have that response. They haven't kind of had the journey that I've had. And that was one of my questions to you when I interviewed you first is, can somebody with the omni view of God even approach this? What has your experience been of somebody who kind of a typical evangelical, God is so big, so strong, so mighty, perfect, unchanging. There's always that one verse. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So that means God doesn't change. I would love to know how somebody like that approaches this text.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a local Baptist minister who's also kind of a friend about that when I broke the news to him about God and autobiography and gave him a copy. But he cited exactly the verse of God being unchanging, the same today, tomorrow, forever.
Right.
And I said, well, this is true of some evangelicals in the movement they call open theology.
Yeah.
Then is there a point in praying and asking God to do something?
Right.
Because that sort of implies that if you pray, God will do it. If you don't pray, he won't.
Yep.
And that means, you're part of the story. The story is evolving. God isn't changing. And we had an interesting discussion where he saw the point of that. God isn't unchanging in some simple-minded way.
Yeah.
Therefore, as soon as you say that, you have an open question of how through.
I think open theology from open theism was a bit of a gateway to process for me, where Greg Boyd, who kind of is the progenitor of that line of thought or made it popular, I had read his stuff for a number of reasons, but then discovered that open theism way of describing the future, where if the future is a chessboard, God can foresee every possible move, right? And make a best guess or something like that. Process is even less determined than that.
Right.
But your book is exploring this, and yeah, like I said, I was really surprised. I was trying to do some research on you, like, are you a process guy, or did this just literally drop out of the sky, or because it was so it just so matched what I had come to understand about God at that point in my journey, and I would say even now, that's kind of where I'm at. I don't think I ever want to settle, but that's where I'm at now in my view of God. That God is evolving and changing with us, and I love that view. Some people say, why would I want to ever serve a God like that? So that opens up all kinds of maybe psychological questions.
Well, and we're living in adventure with God is the point of view that I get from what God told me. I didn't know process theology or any of that. I had no opinions about any of this stuff. Except that I was always surprised as when something contradicted what I took to the standard story, which included omniscience and so forth.
Yeah.
So I would be surprised and question where things just contradicted my preconceptions, but I didn't have beliefs and I wasn't reading theology.
Well, you see, I mean, this might not make the conversation evergreen if I say this, but is it Stephen Fry, the comedian in Britain last week? He's getting censured because he went on a rant about God on the air. And what kind of sadistic sicko would have a kind of world where children are sold into prostitution, and he went on this rant, and now he's facing charges in the UK. But it's funny because I agree with him about that God. This is where the God of your book is sympathetic and lovely, and I think worthy of awe and worship, and it's a camaraderie, it's a partnership, it's beautiful.
Yes.
Where you have the Stephen Frys of the world who are giving it a fair amount of thought, I think, in some ways perhaps more than theologians. What kind of God is causing, like literally ordaining and causing this to happen to the vulnerable people in the world, kind of smiling down on and then saying, it's all for a good reason. Yes, no, everything works out for, we don't understand it. You won't understand it, little humans, but the reason why I had that car accident happen, it was for a good reason. But that doesn't sit well. I don't know if it ever did, but it certainly doesn't in this generation, that's for sure.
Right. And the God who talks to me doesn't say everything is great. He says pain and suffering are just as bad as atheists say they are.
Yes.
So there's no attempt to paper it over. So it ends up a more complex story.
Yeah.
But with God suffering when we suffer. which
Yeah.
is very odd from, again, the classical theist.
Right.
God certainly suffers.
Yes.
Messages here.
Which at a certain point in church history was a heresy, right?
Yeah.
I forget the name for it, Passianism or something. But God can't. God the Father certainly can't. You can't have that. You cannot have a God who is affected by emotion, or because that would implicate change.
Yes.
You had to uphold all these kind of a tower, like when my little 2-year-old puts those cups of different sizes. that if the one underneath is threatened, the whole thing's going to come down. So, you can't have God suffer, because that would implicate God can change, and if God can change, then everything is unbalanced. And I just kind of like the subtle way that your book says that's nothing to fear. God changing, God evolving, God being on a journey and a process. That doesn't undo the universe or ethics or morality. I read a book by, I think it's Terence Fretheim, Creation Untamed, before I kind of got into process seriously. That was kind of one of my really kind of easy entrances in. And he just talked about like things as simple as being able to fall off a cliff. I mean, the world is not a risk-free zone, he called it. Right. So that's true of like tornadoes and hurricanes. There's God did not create this environment that is absolutely free of risk and danger. Right. So when we get in a steel box and drive 100 kilometers down I guess that'd be like 70 miles for you, an hour, 70 miles an hour, on pavement. And you hit something and people die, and we say, how can this thing be allowed to happen?
Yes.
We took a huge risk by getting in a car or flying in a plane, and God didn't create a world that is free of risk. Now, it's easy to understand that with cars and trains perhaps, but he says the same thing about tornadoes and hurricanes and floods. There's something about this sphere we've been put on that is in process. There's still things going on. There's a creating happening. Yeah. And he kind of jumps off of that into like nothing that we see in the world is static. So how come we put that on God? I just so much of the way the world is set up, from having children and that whole thing, seems to be kind of echoing or pointing to God. That's why I love kind of the Big Bang stuff about in the book, the way God was as much a part of the Big Bang. I love that part. It was like watching a movie for me in my mind's eye, but just so I could just feel it viscerally. God waking up when the bang happens and kind of luring everything forward. Like, look at all this light and look at all this matter. And I just love that.
Yeah, I've got to orchestrate this somehow.
Yeah, which again, in the Hebrew Scriptures, like day one of class, because I grew up with the King James Version. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Yes. And my pastor used to say, see, in the beginning, in the beginning. That means there was a beginning. And my first day of Hebrew, I read it in Hebrew, Bereshit, and I put on my hand, I said, this just says begin. And he said, yeah, that's all it says. So beginning, God could be fashioned the heaven. Yeah, just in a begin. It's not the beginning. And she said, no, the scriptures don't seem to concern themselves with anything except chaotic water at the beginning. And I was just like, what? That that my church spent so much time making some kind of rational argument about the beginning, when even the Hebrew scriptures don't concern themselves with that. So this idea of God beginning, I just love. I think you asked the question, what was before the bang? And it was just, that's not a question you can possibly answer, because there's no before.
Yeah, there's no before.
Like it was really neat.
Yeah.
So that, I think, has informed me and how I view the whole world. It's like God was as much surprised by what God was suddenly a part of, and that continues to this day with the fashioning of the world and humans, and it's still happening. Yeah.
No, that I found that chapter profoundly embarrassing. And I was worried about it because it had to come first.
Yeah, chronologically.
Yeah.
I think that's why I pulled, again, I keep saying I think that's why it pulled me in. There's clearly no one reason, but it just reminded me of Fredheim and what I'd written and my Hebrew class. And so it wasn't too out there. I understand that it would be for many people who need to hold white-knuckled onto a certain doctrine, and even the creation out of nothing, the ex nihilo gets really, really debated. But at the end of the day, it's not in Scripture, God creating everything out of nothing.
Yes.
So it's one of those, one of our pet doctrines, I suppose. Again, that Tower of Cups to preserve this other thing. Yeah. But to me, that it's a much more sympathetic view of God. You wouldn't have the Stephen Fry's of this world saying, what kind of sadistic a-hole is God? Right. You wouldn't have that. But B, it explains tragedy better. It explains things as random as a tornado ripping through a trailer park, or children being sold into human trafficking. But this view of God helps explain those things a lot better, I feel.
I also had, as you know, an encounter with Jesus, conversations with him. Now, when I had them, I had no interest in Jesus, just the way at the beginning when God first spoke to me, I had no interest in God.
Yeah. And
in fact, like many people, a bit like your atheist, I was never quite an atheist. I just had no interest in the question of God. But I had no interest in becoming a Christian. Yeah. And now Jesus appears and talks to me, and it's sort of like the Jesus of the New Testament. I don't know if it's like the Jesus of theology, And anyway, did you have any reaction to that? Oh my gosh, here's Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's so funny, because I was just rereading that bit to freshen my memory for this talk, because I remember how important that was for me. Obviously, I have a huge interest in Jesus. Before I interviewed you as part of the podcast, I interviewed somebody called John Suk, who wrote this. I remember the subtitle. Not Sure is the book. Not Sure, A Pastor's Journey from Faith to Doubt. And he went from being kind of a Calvinist predestinarian with the Reformed Church in the U.S. to a United Church minister here in Toronto. So he was one of kind of the first. I sat down with him. He was my first ever Wikigod interview. So I had, the sweaty palms and everything, went to his church office, this author, but really, really a lovely guy. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because he talked about, the United Church gets so, in Canada anyway, so stereotyped as, weak theology, they'll believe anything, but he really challenged that idea, saying, the United Church, or him personally and his church, really take the ethics of Jesus seriously. He said, we're actually quite moralistic. And he compared it to kind of his previous life, where as long as you affirmed the right things about Jesus, the rest was kind of your choice, whether or not you were into the teachings of Jesus or whatever. So he was saying on the podcast, and I never forgot it, Jesus might be God, but if you think Jesus is God, and he said, I'm not even going to offer an opinion about that. He was divine, maybe he was God, maybe he wasn't. I don't get caught up in that. He was at least an ethic, an ethicist to follow. Yes. If you believe he's God, then you at least down here is like the ethicist.
Yeah.
So somehow, I don't know how the church has gone up to, he's God, but the ethicist part, I don't know. He talked really confusing parable. Anyway, Paul is really cool because he's so understandable. That seems to be what the church has done. So when Jesus kind of appears in your book, it reminded me of that. And again, just fell in line with that. I was so surprised that God was saying that God appeared, kind of expressed God's self in Jesus.
Right. Yes.
And even that the part where you talk about Jesus, where Jesus appears, it didn't dwell too much on doctrinal, theological, intellectual brain pretzels. It was affirming kind of what we might say doctrinally about Jesus, that Jesus was God's pure revelation,
Yes.
and someone to listen to and follow. And again, that one of my kind of hobby horses now has become, how come we don't obsess about Jesus's teachings the way other faiths, and your book has really gotten me on this, the usefulness, the wisdom of the other traditions. There's so much good in, like, the Tao Te Ching and all these other, your book is just kind of shot through with texts from other faiths and other traditions.
I was told to go read those and them, and kind of what was God up to in the which I don't know what you just mentioned, the I Ching or the Tao Te Ching and so forth. These what was he up to with the Chinese and the Hindus and so forth. That was
so Christianity spends so much time kind of using apologetics or what have you to explain why our texts are superior. But I love how, your book kind of pushed back on that. God pushed back on that in the book and just said, go read them and you will find a core, a nugget, and even parts that might be challenging, like the caste system gets built into kind of, traditions around the Sanskrit or Hinduism, but if you strip away the cultural biases and things like that even Christianity does not escape from. Every tradition has kind of missed the boat on that one, endorsing slavery or whatever. You can see a core in each one. Mm-hmm. And that was huge for me. So Jesus appearing as uniquely divine, somebody to follow, somebody to listen to, was really important for me. But then also just taking his teachings as seriously as other faiths take their great wisdom traditions. I grew up in the church, went to seminary, and most of my time has been spent circling the wagons around doctrines. And there's no classes in seminary about the parables of Jesus or the ethics of Jesus, or why are ministers like myself being sent out into the world without necessarily needing to understand what, the parable of the talents or the 99 sheep or the lost son, or we didn't really have to sit and wrestle with those. We better know our doctrine of the incarnation, though, or atonement theory,
But Jesus did not lay out a system of doctrines, did he?
That's right.
Parables. So presumably that's where the gold is.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. The divinely inspired Jesus presenting the way of life. Again, that's the wisdom tradition is there's a life way and there's a death way, and that's not afterlife. Your book talks about that. The kingdom of God is here, and it's not an after thing. It's a now thing. And there's even a part that I dog-eared because you go into a little debate about the kingdom of God. I loved it. God, why did you put it as if they're not going to die? And look at the language. But you say it'll happen during their lifetime, but it sounds like the kingdom of God is a second coming or an apocalypse or something like that. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. You're reading that in. The kingdom of God is the reception into the soul of God's presence. I mean, I think that made me put the book down, and because that's so true. Jesus spent all this time talking, and he wasn't just waiting around for, one day I'm finally going to get arrested and then the show's going to start. He spent a lot of time going around trying to convince people this way of life, this reception of the soul into the reign of God, and wanted it to happen right then and there for people.
Yes.
And so I've become really convicted of that through your book, but then also more interested in Christians taking the teachings of Jesus at least as seriously as Confucians take Confucius, or even as Muslims take Muhammad. I don't know why the teachings of Jesus have become so optional to being a Christian.
This is a chance for you to say what you're up to today.
Okay.
Tomorrow, you have a present and a future, and What's going on?
So through the process, you talk about where were you in Wikigod. I went through 2 years of incredible interviews and talking to people like yourself. And it came to a point where I just said, it's time for the talk to end for me and time for something to start. So really, one thing that I discovered in that process was asset-based community development, creating the kind of neighborhood that we want to see, not just for neighborhood's sake, but this idea that neighborhoods are where lives are lived.
Yes.
And it's how cities are changed and countries are changed. You got to start somewhere, start in your neighborhood, start people relating to each other. So all the kind of scourges of society, loneliness and vandalism and all that, that's neighborhood stuff. That's family stuff. So I am focusing my efforts on asset-based community development. I am continuing to just be a theology geek. Churches are asking me to speak and things like that. So I'm going to be teaching next month. I started a little hashtag on Facebook. You probably have seen it. Jesus is my guru, which a lot of people love, but paid salaried churchmen absolutely hate the things I'm saying. So it can be a bit polarizing, this notion of taking Jesus seriously as a teacher, being troubled by his teachings and his ethic. But I blame you for that. You're a crucial part of why this has happened to me.
Well, I'm very grateful for that blame.
So thanks for putting that book into the world. And yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for the interview. And,
Right.
I look forward to seeing you again. Maybe we'll do a second round sometime.